I'm Amanda Leitner, and welcome to Rochester Rising, where we amplify the stories of Rochester entrepreneurs. Welcome to episode 237 of the podcast. Whether this is your very first time joining us on the Rochester Rising podcast, or if you tune in every week, thank you so much for deciding to spend some time with us today to learn more about small business and the culture of entrepreneurship in Rochester, Minnesota. We hope that you learn something today from entrepreneurs themselves that can help with your own business journey. Here at Rochester Rising, we release a podcast each Wednesday. You can find the podcast on our website at rochesterrising.org, or you can catch it wherever you prefer to listen into your podcasts. We're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify, we have a playlist on our Rochester Rising YouTube channel, but you can really find the podcast on your favorite podcast catcher. In addition to our podcasts, we also have many articles and videos that we've created over the past 5 years, telling the stories of both new and very experienced business owners. And you can find all of that on our website, again at rochesterrising.org. Here at Rochester Rising, we are a part of the nonprofit Collider. This is a Rochester-based organization that activates, connects, and empowers early-stage entrepreneurs in the community. You can learn more about Collider and how this organization can help accelerate and assist your entrepreneurial journey at collider.mn. Rochester Rising was launched in 2016 to tell stories of entrepreneurship taking place within the city of Rochester, Minnesota, especially stories that otherwise would not have been told. We really take a lot of time to understand each entrepreneur and what their experience has been like in the community. If you find value in this podcast, if you tune in every week and find that you learn something every time you listen in, please consider donating. If you can, we would really, really appreciate you giving our tip jar a visit so that we can keep telling these stories for the community. We have a virtual tip jar that I have a link to in the show notes, as well as a button if you are on our website. We use the local business for giving for our tip jar and for our general fundraising efforts at Collider. You can donate one time to the tip jar or set up a recurring donation. Again, we would really, really appreciate that to continue having Rochester Rising be a stable part of our efforts here at Collider. You can find more information about our tip jar and how to donate through forgiving through the link in our show notes or the button, again, if you are on our website. So welcome to our very first podcast of August 2021. So for the next few weeks, we are continuing our Summertime Rewind series, taking a look back at some of your favorite podcasts from the last 5 years of shows at Rochester Rising. Today, we're revisiting podcast episode 119, which originally aired on February 27th, 2019. This episode was part of our From the Edge series, where we talked about trends in entrepreneurship with regional guests. In this episode, we chatted with Courtney Bergey Swanson, a community and business development specialist with Community and Economic Development Associates, or CEDA, and Nathan Wiedenman, who at the time was a senior technology IP development manager and is now the director of the Office of Translation to Practice at Mayo Clinic. Today, we have a really full conversation to share with you about tech and high-growth entrepreneurship, rural entrepreneurship, and building inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems. When I was listening back to this conversation, I remembered how informative it was and how engaging it was, so you're in for a real treat today. If you didn't catch this a few years ago, and if you did, I think it's a great time to revisit this conversation we had today. Before we launch into today's podcast, we just wanted to acknowledge our sponsor, Clifton Larson Allen, or CLA. The team at CLA would love to get to know you, learn more about your vision, and see if they can help. CLA is a full-service CPA firm with over 100 offices nationally, including right here in Rochester. Sure, they do taxes and audits, but they also focus on helping startups refine their vision, build budgets, work with banks and investors, and track and organize their accounting. They are deeply experienced at building the business systems that allow you to focus on what you do best, getting product market fit, growing sales, hiring talent, and creating a thriving enterprise. Contact Todd Churchill at toddchurchill@claconnect.com or give him a call at 507-280-2317 to learn more. So now on to podcast episode 237 with Courtney and Nathan. All right, so thanks everybody for being here today. We have 4 guests for our second From the Edge podcast today. So it's always co-hosted by Jamie Sonsbach, so he's here as well.
Hello.
And we'll let our 2 guests introduce yourselves.
Good morning. My name is Courtney Bergey Swanson, and I work as the Director of Community Engagement for Community and Economic Development Associates. And we are a nonprofit that serves mostly rural Southeast Minnesota cities and counties, and also a couple rural electric cooperatives. We provide economic and community development services, so anything that the city wants, everything from building a campground to coaching small businesses to babysitting during an info session for an upcoming housing forum. So I am really excited to be here and talk about entrepreneurship and what I'm seeing in the rural communities around Rochester.
That is so cool. My name is Nathan Wiedenman. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited as well to be a part of this. I am officially a technology development manager in the Office of Translation to Practice at Mayo. I'm not here in my official capacity as a Mayo employee, but more as a person who has spent a lot of time in the entrepreneurial world. I recently came to Rochester about a year ago, actually spent 4 years in the Boston entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I've seen the nitty-gritty and sausage making of sort of a large entrepreneurial ecosystem and kind of how that works with, lots of universities spinning out companies with crazy new innovations and lots of good, lots of bad, and had a lot of experience evaluating technologies, evaluating business maturity of those companies, and just had a really good experience with that. And I'm happy to see some of the things that are happening in Rochester and the differences between a large and a medium or small ecosystem like we have here. So just really interested to see how that is progressing and being a part of that.
Awesome. We definitely have some very unique perspectives around the table today, which was the whole point of this, was to get together people who probably have never met before. So we accomplished that at least today, if nothing else happens.
Well, that's setting our goals really.
We gotta set the bar realistically.
We're bracketing, various ends of the spectrum here.
Yes. Great. So we asked each of you to bring some trend that you're seeing in entrepreneurship to the table today to kind of discuss and just have a real laid-back conversation. So would either of you like to get started today with that conversation?
I'm not sure how applicable this is to everybody in the room necessarily, but one of the things that I have seen, and there's been some press about this lately, is sort of a reaction to the Silicon Valley venture capital model that is so entirely focused on rapid growth startups. When everybody talks about technology in Silicon Valley, they're talking about software companies. And to me, technology is so much broader than that. A lot of the technology that we do here in Rochester, of course, is medical focused, a lot of devices, that sort of thing. And the kind of rapid growth that VCs traditionally are looking for and expecting is just not possible with that kind of company, with a hardware-based company or anything that requires any sort of regulatory approval from the government. And so the timelines that are pushed and requested by VC firms just don't really work. And so there are new models popping up. And we saw this a little bit. I saw this a little bit in Boston for hardware-focused companies. MIT had a new entity. There was a thing called Bolt, and I can talk more about each of those. But we're focused on hardware. We're focused on longer-term development, and I think that's something that needs to be considered and expanded to places that are not just focused on I can scale my company to a unicorn with 15 employees because all we're doing is spitting out software patches every week. And that works in some places, but it just doesn't work everywhere. And we want entrepreneurship to be more than I'm starting the next Facebook. We want it to be much broader so that people can start new businesses and new opportunities that can grow fast and that can scale, but not in the same way that a purely software-based company could. So that's the kind of thing that I'm really interested and focused on right now.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with all your points. That's something that, recently things like Steve Case and Rise of the Rest has tried to really, get literally in a bus and go to some areas that are not Boston or San Francisco and actually highlight some of these things happening and making investments in them. And I think that starts to highlight that there are other things than just sort of the pure standard technology that you'd think of in Silicon Valley. But I think that model, you're right, has been so tuned to sort of the Sandhill Road VC life. Yeah. It's very much the lazy model, right? We're going to create this ecosystem that's very, very close to us. We don't have to get on a plane. They come to us. And we just see, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pitches. And sure, some really good stuff is going to shake out. But as an investor, you're looking for, a 10x plus return in a few years, which is nuts in anything else other than pure technology.
Well, all of their timelines are like 10 years. I have a fund, and in 10 years, I need to return 5, 7, 10x. And I'm not investing in everything right up front, so I'm investing in some things halfway through the fund. So I'm expecting a large growth within, 3 to 5 years from this startup. And so the focus becomes on turning around growth and value and not on I'm producing something that actually impacts the world in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and I think this goes back, I think we talked a little bit about this the last time too, a little bit of redefining what entrepreneurship is, because entrepreneurship isn't growing. That's a part of it, these high growth potential companies, but I think it also...
But it can't be narrowly defined as just that.
Right, it can't be narrowly defined, and there is a lot of value in steady and stable growth. I think it's all in looking at your personal risk assessment, looking at what you want, what your end goal is. And entrepreneurship includes, small businesses on Main Street. It's not just these high growth potential businesses. And definitely exactly what you're talking about, you don't get these massive payouts in 5 years with healthcare companies, because there's the business end and then there's the scientific and healthcare end. And when something's going into a person, something's affecting health, this is not a 5-year timeline.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're putting it into a patient or impacting a patient in a medical environment. Absolutely. It's not something you're not going to move fast and break things in that situation. It doesn't work. You might break things. Well, you might, but you're going to suffer the consequences if you do. So that the model has to be different. And I think, as you say, Jamie, with Steve Case and others, we're starting to see people who are recognizing things don't have to exist just in Boston or Silicon Valley. Those are great concentrations, but they tend towards this, rapid growth model because they've got such a huge feed of so many sort of pitches to choose from that they can pick the ones that give them the rapid turnaround. And let's be honest, from a VC's perspective, the incentive system is to turn around and make a lot of money as quickly as possible. That's fine. That's our incentive system. But that doesn't necessarily, we have to admit to ourselves, that doesn't necessarily foster the things that are going to make the world a better place. It fosters things that are going to grow rapidly. Full stop. That's all that it does. Yeah. And so when you see Rise of the Rest and other places, other things that are trying to work on other geographic locations, or even look at other types of technology beyond just the rapid growth software-based company, you're starting to see more hardware. You have to have a different model. And I love that we're starting to see more of that, and we should be continuing to push it, because that's going to be vital for who we are here in Rochester.
Yeah, definitely what I call the rise of patient capital. When I'm talking about patient, I'm not talking about medical patients. I'm talking about investors, and in many cases, we're starting to see a lot of family foundations who are patient. They're actually taking more of a 20, 30, 40-year horizon, and with the idea of course, they want some sort of return.
Sure.
But they know this stuff's going to take time. And that's something I'm seeing a lot of when I talk to people from Silicon Valley who are reaching out and wondering what's going on here in Rochester. They come with this mentality that my software tool X, which exists as an app, will solve people's snoring problems and apnea problems. And it's like, well, maybe it can help, but it's not going to solve it. So it's very, I always use the Mark Andreessen quote, software eats the world. That's the attitude. It's like everything can be fixed with software, and that's not necessarily true. I think anything you create will have a tech component now. That's just the way it is. But it's not the be-all and end-all. It's a way you gather data.
Yeah.
Of course, data is very...
It's a means, not an end unto itself. Yeah.
And so I think the rise of patient capital, the rise of people who get the idea that maybe they made their money being employee number 6 of Facebook, but now they look at other industries like healthcare and like education, and they realize that there's a need for their expertise to work alongside really talented people, whether it's teachers in education, whether it's docs who are creating great medical devices. They need to work together with them, and they need to let it take time. There's always ways that we could try to speed up some of the government regulation stuff, but that's...
Speaking as someone who spent 20 plus years working for the federal government, good luck.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think it's actually a lot more feasible to invent that sort of patient capital and get that deployed and working than it would be to do that. But I think ultimately that's potentially the success stories that come out of that will help inform, hopefully, with whether it's lobbying dollars or just showing examples, it'll actually inform government policy in the long run.
Well, and I think you're starting to see, speaking to the government perspective, more potential for public-private partnerships that have a little bit more long-term patience for technology development. Certainly in the Department of Defense, there's been a lot of emphasis over the last 4 or 5 years on trying to reach out to the startup community. And defense technology is not rapid growth software. It might be in some small cases, but for the most part, you're talking about really hard technology challenges, and the DoD recognizes that and needs to foster that kind of. And they're producing entities that will enable that kind of thing. Places like SoftWorks and AppWorks and places like that have more patience for technology development, and so those sorts of entities are a good sign, but it can't be, necessarily government focused. It needs to have, something like what, Rise of the Rest and others are doing, looking at other geographic areas for their own sake.
So, kind of an interesting segue to our most quiet speaker. That's great, and we talk about breaking away from these major centers where, you just have this massive entrepreneurial density. And then you have 3rd, 4th, 5th tier cities. I don't know where Rochester would fall. Depends on who's measuring, I guess. And we can talk about, obviously, attracting some of that talent, attracting some of those dollars eventually. What about the rural areas? The areas where you're talking about measuring populations in the hundreds, even, not the thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. How can we jumpstart an area's entrepreneurs? What do those entrepreneurs look like compared to, say, the middle of Rochester?
Well, thank you, Nathan, for all of that awesome information about tech and software, all of which is totally out of my realm of understanding. And I was jotting down some, interesting juxtapositions because you're talking about things that are moving very fast and really growth-oriented, cloud-based, tech-heavy. The thing that I want to talk about today is actually, I brought along a prop, which I understand this
props.
is a podcast, but
Awesome.
I brought a bottle of bourbon.
Excellent. This is a good prop.
It is officially, for the record, it is 10:24 a.m. and it's a good time to start.
So bourbon takes a long time to make, right? It takes years to have a good bourbon. Which is very different from a fast tech startup, try to get things out, updates every day kind of thing. Instead of being cloud-based, this is very place-based. It's all about the soil, the ingredients, the town. But there's a lot of similarities too with like government regulations and solving problems and trying to figure out how fast to scale and where that capital comes from. And so I guess, the thing that that I'm seeing a lot in rural communities is really interesting around people who grew up there moving back there. Often it's kind of a creative class of folks who are really dedicated to their hometown and probably didn't realize it when they left. I mean, I actually was raised on a farm near Lanesboro, which is just about 40 minutes from Rochester. And now I work in Spring Grove, Minnesota, which is about half hour past Lanesboro. So about an hour and 15 minutes south of Rochester, almost to the Iowa border. And so what I'm seeing is a lot of these young entrepreneurs who, maybe moved away for college, moved away to another city, started a family, and then now they're moving back to start a business. And they're definitely not getting rich off of these businesses right now, but I think that's secondary to what they want to do. And I really liked what you said about these apps aren't necessarily going to solve all the world's problems. Yeah. They're not going to make the world a better place. And I think when some of these businesses that I'm working with, some of the entrepreneurs I'm working with, they just want to make their community a better place. Yeah. That definitely seeing trends of young people moving back, definitely seeing growth in the food sector and the spirit sector. This bourbon is from Rock Filter Distillery, which is a local fella, moved, went away for a while, was in the military, came back, and farmed with his father and decided in the winter, like, hey, I kind of want to make bourbon with my corn, and what he said is, Kentucky is known for bourbon, but we, what they are kind of touting is their water, their limestone filtered water. Well, we here have limestone filtered water, but we're just upstream. So I'm really excited to kind of hear what you all are thinking and seeing, and I'm even seeing a lot of these trends in Rochester too. But locally, there's a lot of businesses that I'd love to explore a little bit more and help them figure out some of these questions of scale and where to move forward.
No, I think that's a great point that you said about these individuals who moved away, who are coming back, who are maybe taking over family farms or acreages and really diversifying. So they're looking, again, I think this goes back to entrepreneurship is entrepreneurship. They're facing the same things, how do we scale? How do we diversify? How do we maximize our potential to sustain this? And maybe that means, diversifying your acreage with something different. Like, for example, Sybil Sass hops around Chatfield, converting corn acreage. And my headphones fell off.
That's an edit.
Got too into it. Converting corn acreage into hops farming. Right. Would the parents want to do that? Maybe not. So it's, thinking about what's the future. How do you capitalize on a business that's been around for generations and make it your own and give it your own spin to take it into the future? So I think, again, it goes back to, what do you want to accomplish? What does your lifestyle that you want to achieve look like? And again, I see a big push too in this new generation and wanting to make the community a better place, and contributing to that, which I think is really positive momentum for all of us, really.
So, Courtney, I'm curious about something. When I think about I'm used to Boston. I'm used to Rochester, which is smaller scale and a little more focused than Boston. And an entrepreneurial ecosystem in those places tends to be very concentrated. Obviously, in a rural environment, it's much more diffuse, and you got to have access to a lot of things. But three big things always stick out in my mind. You got to have access to capital. Somebody's got to be paying for this, and there's only so much your family and friends can do for you. You've got to have sources of innovation, which in a big place like Rochester or Boston, tends to be academic institutions, be it Mayo here or be it, MIT, Harvard, Boston College, BU, all of that in Boston. So sources of innovation, and then you got to have a workforce. So in a rural environment, people have their own innovations. You don't have to have an academic institution to come up with innovations. I mean, bourbon is, and being able to create something like that, that's an innovation that can be done by an individual. You don't need to have access to, labs necessarily in a big academic environment in order to be able to do that. So innovation is not a thing that is lacking in a rural environment. But it feels like the other two may be access to capital and access to a workforce. But maybe I'm wrong because I've worked in that environment before, so I'm curious.
No, those are great points, and I want to say thank you. You're right. There is a lot of innovation in rural communities.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that story is sometimes untold, but I think about like farmers. Oh, my combine broke down. How am I going to fix it? And they figure out how to fix it. Or, there's just so many ways to look at that. But yeah, you're right. Capital is a huge issue. Oftentimes what I'm seeing is people who do have some savings and have worked really, really hard to get to that point. But then they also, with local banks, I think local banks are being really supportive of those ventures. And then also the local governments too. So I work for the Spring Grove Economic Development Authority through my role in CEDA, and we have a revolving loan fund that we offer very low interest loans to businesses for startup and expansion. The county has the same thing, so I'm talking like 3% loans to fill the gap. And frankly, we're taking a lot of risks, but I think we see that if you don't take a risk, there's then you're not moving forward.
Right.
And then workforce, it is a huge issue, but I think some of these businesses are actually trying to solve that in itself because they know that if there's a cool distillery in town, their friends are going to maybe consider moving back and filling the empty houses and going into the available storefronts. Workforce is an issue everywhere and will be. And I think for my bigger manufacturers and bigger employers, it is a constant struggle. But for smaller businesses like Rock Filter or a lot of just one woman, one man shops, like another great entrepreneur that I've had the pleasure of working with her name is Dana Burtness, and she is a heritage pig farmer. And she basically bought some land that was not tillable, basically like a hilly, kind of rocky, like foresty type land, and she raises pigs there who just like eat nettles and herbs from the wild.
What a great reuse
and so
of
that's
that resource.
right. It's a great way to show innovation. And then workforce. It's her. She's out there feeding the pigs, and so those are great things, and they're definitely things that are going to continue to be top of mind for us.
So do you think that? And I totally thank you. I appreciate the thoughts there. The capital is something I wanted to come back to. You mentioned some of the work you do with CEDA and the resources that are available. And we see some of that here with RADI, with the Rochester Area Economic Development, and others, the Southeast Minnesota Fund and things like that. Yep. Those feel like, and maybe I'm off base, but those feel like stuff to get things started. Are they enough to sustain? Or are you shifting to more reliance on banks for longer term, access to capital, loans, that sort of thing to make things function in the long term?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've done several. It kind of depends on the project, but a lot of it is either startup or expansion funding, and then some of the financing that businesses need, like a line of credit or things to make cash flow. We've also done things like that too.
It's sort of a transition to now I'm a stable long-term business and I just need access to capital.
Right, maybe I need to make this strategic investment here to make it go. Like, can we get an extra $20,000 on our loan? That sort of thing happens.
To that point. My impression, again, I may be off base here, is that there has been some consolidation of small town banks, and you're seeing fewer of those. And how has that impacted the availability of capital for companies, for new startups being able to have the capital that they need over the long term?
That is true. I think has been a lot of consolidation. I haven't heard necessarily that that's been a negative in terms of the relationships that they've built. A lot of these bankers, have grown up with the people.
Yeah, they're part of the community.
Right. And so it's definitely it's very, very different from my relationship to my banker at US Bank across the street, right? Like my banker growing up used to babysit me, and so having those relationships, I think, does have a really big impact on it. Economically, I'm not sure how it's working out, but I think it seems to be positive. But yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue, and frankly, I've been trying to figure out ways to find innovative sources of capital that aren't just tapping into the local banks and the local governments. Like, what would it look like to start a rural investment cooperative where people can, instead of investing their money in a 401k that they, don't actually know what's going into it, like what if there was like a local real estate cooperative that you could buy property or, have land that you could rent to own for small farmers who are just getting started. And so I've been kind of thinking about that a lot, and stay tuned. Hopefully there'll be some, new innovations in that way too, as rural communities start to change. And wealth is shifting hugely in rural communities too, because there's actually a lot of money tied up in the land. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these older farmers are, getting to the point where they have to either sell or the kids may or may not take it over. And there's a lot of capital that's going to be changing hands in the next 10 years. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens.
So in addition to that, and this kind of ties back to the workforce question, is, assuming success, not every company succeeds, but assuming they do, and as you bring in, if you have people moving back to the community, then you're not really changing the face of the community all that much. But if you have newer folks coming from, who aren't from this area originally, who, come from different cultures, different backgrounds, as that changes the nature of the community, do you see friction? Do you see, this is a national issue. We're not going to get into, politics on that. But, when you have larger workforces coming in to work at the distillery or at the pig facility or something like that, how does that, how is that seen and how does that reflect back on the whole idea of entrepreneurship in a rural environment?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think every community is so different. And yes, you're right. That's been a big source of tension for a lot of communities. I have not seen that in the communities that I work in because it hasn't happened yet, but I think it is coming. I know there's a lot of communities that are doing really, really innovative things around it, and I feel like there's kind of a hump you get over. Like, I believe Faribault, their economic development authority has looked at ways that they can be training banks for Sharia compliant law and lending, just because there's different cultural ways of looking at that. And so I think that's really admirable. And in terms of integrating new groups into the communities, I think that is going to be a huge challenge. But frankly, I think small towns really need to embrace that and look at how they can kind of make themselves as welcoming and hospitable as possible to newcomers, for sure.
Welcome, survive, and grow, or stay the same and die.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a good transition to you, Jamie, as someone who's working to create, this isn't a problem just in, rural communities. Inclusivity is also an issue in cities the size of Rochester.
Yep, absolutely. And that's something that we're beginning in the very, very early stages to address with our nonprofit, the Collider Foundation. The sort of mission statement is to promote an inclusive and healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem in Rochester. We had to pick, sort of a boundary on what we serve. So right now it's just Rochester. But yeah, that inclusivity piece. I have no data to back this up, but I would say if we tap into some of the communities that we probably don't hear from, whether they be the Latino community, whether they be the Somali population here, what are we missing? What are their barriers? And what we want to do as a foundation is attempt to understand that, not jump up and tell people the way things should be and the way things that have worked for us because we don't understand those barriers, but really try to work to understand that in association, in concert with these groups, and hopefully be able to come up with solutions to really bring everybody to the table of entrepreneurship here in Rochester, because you're seeing this time and time again in other communities, that diversity aspect leads to just some amazing things happening. Collider's sort of a mini microcosm of what can happen when you just put people in a room. The thing that struck me over the last 2.5 years is those people, by and large, are very much the same. And I know that our community is big enough where there's other people that maybe we haven't marketed to the right way. Maybe they feel intimidated by being here. So we want to really find a way to bring everyone together. And it's going to be super hard. We're currently looking for donations to fund our efforts.
The obligatory pitch.
Yeah. So it's tough, but I think it's doable. And I think just engaging a great representative of various groups, especially, what we're looking for are successful entrepreneurs. So if we can find a successful Somali entrepreneur, I want to get to know that person. I want to understand some of the barriers they had as they created their business here, and what we can do together to bring everybody together. And I'm starting this with what they call beginner's mind. I just don't know what I don't know. And I want to bring people into the equation that do know some of this stuff, and try to not impose my sort of worldview on how entrepreneurs work, which is actually a very Silicon Valley tech-centric, like you just have to grind it out, and you have to do all this, and you have to work 300-hour weeks, and you have to do all this, and it should just happen because of that. And that's not necessarily true, as we well know. And that's hard enough. Now adding a lot of other barriers, and from perceptions that people may have of individuals to just people maybe being afraid to do it because they walk into a place like Collider, and I think we have a good male to female ratio, which is fantastic. But in the early days, I could see maybe that. Even
it was not like that in the early days. I'll tell you that.
I was going to say, I was trying to get you to say something, but I didn't know if you wanted to say it.
We read this really great piece, or I don't know if you read it. I sent it to you yesterday.
Sure, I read it.
That was published through Kauffman Foundation, but they had some really great points about, first of all, what inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems. So first of all, there's kind of a new model of economic development where it's not, they talk about like the first wave is probably what we mostly think of economic development is incentivizing businesses to come to your area. Does that work? Sure. But I think they're calling this the fourth wave, is where you actually empower individuals within your communities, exactly what you're talking about in rural communities, to build these things. So that was a great part of it. But they also really talked about the value of inclusive and diverse entrepreneurial ecosystems. And one thing you have to keep in mind is inclusive can mean a lot of things.
Yes.
So it's really important to really understand if you're being successful, you really have to think about, okay, what populations, what are your specific targets that you're trying to be inclusive? Is it seniors? Because I never thought about that and laid that out in this article. Seniors are like 1 in 4 seniors want to start a business. Is it seniors? Is it...
it's surprising how much older entrepreneurs tend to be than our Silicon Valley-based image.
Most people think the average entrepreneur is 22.
It's like 45 or something.
I think it's 45 or above.
Mid-40s.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no.
As a person who is 42 years old.
But so is it seniors? Is it a specific demographic? Do you want to grow... We'll go back to software companies, because I think that, we don't have that many software companies in Rochester, I don't think. So is that what you're targeting? So being inclusive and diverse can mean different things. So you have to be very intentional about what you're targeting.
And you got to have those representative voices.
Well, exactly.
To the point you were making earlier, Jamie, about making sure that you have, as you're growing, having the right, the right balance, the right diversity of not just backgrounds but opinions.
Right.
You got to have representative voices in leadership.
Exactly.
Boards, that sort of thing. So
yeah, you don't just get their opinion; they need to be at the table. I think that's the major point in it. Because otherwise, you're telling them what they need, then giving them. They're beside you, leading it, or, helping to make those decisions. That's the end of my
that
was a really great article, though. It was really laid out very well. And
to tie this back, and this may be a leap, but when we were talking earlier about moving away from the Silicon Valley model, the Silicon Valley model tends to be like we said, rapid growth, VC, rapid returns. But it also tends to be, because of the makeup of the VC community, let's be honest, it also tends to be focused on a demographic that looks a lot like VCs. And frankly, speaking as a white male, that is a white male community.
I mean, that's statistically proven.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's harder for women-led companies to get capital. It's harder for minority-led companies to get capital. It turns almost into a white male subsidy system, and that's not good for anybody, including white males. It should be competitive. It should be meritorious, merit-based. It should be, what's the good idea? What's going to meet the VC's requirements and incentive system, which is making money, okay. But what's also going to make the world a better place? What is the incentive system we're setting up? And it needs to be as inclusive as we can possibly make it, and it needs to be as representative as we can possibly make it. And so moving away from those kind of models that tend to be self-reinforcing in one particular demographic direction, it takes conscious effort. We have to stop, we have to think, and we have to include people, and we have to give them the right opportunities. There was a great incubator, accelerator is probably a better term, called Smarter in the City in Boston. Loved these guys. They were I can't remember if they were in Dorchester or Jamaica Plain. Anyways, they were in some of the lower socioeconomic locations. They weren't in downtown Boston. They were trying expressly to focus on companies led by underserved populations. And it was a struggle, but they worked hard, and they really pushed and tried to do the right thing and get the right companies. And they had some fantastic successes that then, companies went from Smarter in the City and pushed to other places within the Boston ecosystem, other incubators, accelerators, places, and then started to see more and more success. And so raising that profile made a difference. Having organizations who are explicitly focused on that made a difference. I think that's important for everywhere that we're doing this.
Yeah, so what would it look like if Rochester started to look for opportunities for business associations that were led by the Somali community or the Latino community? And there's so many people, I think, under the radar who are entrepreneurs. They're just not on the surface because they either haven't gotten the support. They're braiding hair out of their home. They're cooking tamales out of their home. Yep. And those are the things that we want in the community, right? Like we want those. I want to eat tamales,
and drink bourbon with it.
And drink bourbon with it, yeah. And so, I'm really...
While getting your hair braided.
I'm energized.
Business here.
I'm energized by this conversation because I think it's really important. And I think one of the reasons that I love living in Rochester is because of how diverse it is. And I want it to continue becoming more of a welcoming and inclusive place.
And I think inclusive, to this broad definition, also, can sort of be urban and rural, right? And I know Techstars, one of the big business accelerators out there, again, using the word tech in something, but we'll go with it.
We're assuming the broader definition of the term tech.
They're very interested in this sort of finding urban centers, small population, sub 200,000 urban centers. Urban, quotation marks for people living in giant cities that are listening to this and rolling their eyes, but that have a broad base of rural communities around them, because that's a gap. When they do their gap analysis across the nation, it's super easy to go to Boston, super easy to go to any other big city, but what they're trying to do is say, hey, can we contribute to building a healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem that serves that hub as well as the rural communities around it. So, it's creating gatherings that are inclusive of people in the rural side of things, but maybe doing it, centering it in that urban, drivable, location, but really focusing on the rural piece of it. So the urban sort of center serves as,
the hub and spoke sort of
hub
model.
And spoke for mentorship, for potential investment and things like that, but really then pushing it back out into rural. It's something they're just getting started, but I think you'll see more stuff like that, whether it's Rise of the Rest, because even Rise of the Rest tends to focus on these second or third tier cities. and they say, look at this great ecosystem we have, but they very rarely go out and do things more in the rural areas. And so I really think that is sort of the next frontier to focus on. And I think, we can be a little bit arrogant and pat ourselves on the back, but I think we're ideally situated, to be inclusive of everyone in a region. I always say the only thing I discriminate on is a really, really bad idea. I don't care who it comes from. If you've got a terrible idea, I'm going to tell you have a terrible idea.
It's best to cut that, early.
Yeah, it just
that's a service.
Make their life better, and that's the thing.
Everybody,
That's the only thing I'm trying. Sometimes these unconscious biases creep in, but really, I'm trying to judge someone when they sit down with me and they say, "This is what I'm working on." I'm trying to judge the idea and help them, or be blunt and tell them it's not a great idea, and then encouraging them to continue to come up with ideas, because the worst thing you can do is have someone execute on an idea that is just not going to work. Now, I'm not the ultimate authority on what works or what doesn't work, but I think there's enough experience there where I can help guide that.
So I'm curious about something. We talk about the idea of the semi-urban or urban centers, these smaller cities that are surrounded by more rural areas. Rochester being a great example of that, being a hub for the surrounding rural area. In the hub and spoke model, surrounding urban area or rural area, having access to resources, mentorship, and capital and things like that. But logistics is so painful and so difficult. How in a city, we take the bus across town or the train across town and we go to the meetup. If I'm working on at the distillery and I want to get some advice, I got to schlep into the city. I got to schlep into Rochester. And so how do we make that easier for the folks out there? Do we bring it to them? Or do we, make it easier for them to come in, or some mix thereof? What's the solution to get them the right access to the right resources at the right time?
Yeah,
that seems like that's a tech-focused solution.
Hey,
it might be. Yeah, I mean that is. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's kind of what I was thinking. Is like, us rural people, we're sick of driving to the cities for things, and it is.
You want to be surrounded by trees and stuff, you pay the price.
Well, and there are. I would say there are already some of those resources on a much smaller scale, like mentorship. Like if a new business opens in downtown Spring Grove.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that none of those existed in a rural environment, but it tends to be concentrated here, and so you want to have access.
And it's much less formal, which I think is something we need to get back to. Is like, resources for people like me whose job it is to help businesses, and so I'm out there pounding the pavement, visiting people, and I think bringing in more of those resources to those communities would be really interesting. But I think that is something to think about, webinars and Google Hangouts and conversations that can get them some of the resources and the training they need without necessarily having to take the whole day to drive somewhere.
Yeah, I mean,
really,
go ahead, sorry.
That's the idea behind sort of this collider philosophy, right? Whether you're traveling to the city or whether people are traveling out there, or whether you're meeting over a Google Hangouts to talk, I think you just have to kind of, get exposure to as many people as possible and meet as many people as possible and share your story with as many people as possible. And I think that's the true amplifier for what's going on. So I don't think I meant to imply that, hey, everybody should come to this urban center and we're going to teach you.
But you should all come to Collider.
You should all come to Collider. We have very affordable rates for co-working. This podcast is not sponsored by Collider. But, it's just mixing these groups together and finding ways to really think of ourselves as one community, I think will have tremendous benefits, because I've seen time and time again where, the bourbon example, that person could stop by Collider, maybe give us some free samples, and suddenly, the next week someone's up in the cities and they just run into someone who's a vendor for a big company, and they say, hey, you have to taste this bourbon. Yeah. It's awesome. So by putting the bug in as many ears as possible, that just leads to so many different avenues for success. So it's just trying to find that right mix, I think, and that's, of course, easier said than done.
Making those connections is so key. I mean, that's part of your marketing, part of your strategy. But setting, back to something you were saying earlier, Courtney, about you're out there pounding the pavement, and I think we need to make sure that for organizations that are looking to support rural entrepreneurship, there needs to be a setting of expectations that it is going to take longer. It takes more effort because you're frankly just moving farther distances, and there may not be as good, internet access. The speeds are much lower or tend to be lower in certain rural areas. And so being able to do things like webinars or Google Hangouts or Skype or whatever becomes more problematic. There are barriers that we perhaps at a state or national level can start to try and work to overcome, improve that infrastructure so that we, if we really care about the idea as opposed to just growing and making money. If we care about the idea, the ideas are just as good everywhere. Yep. And we want to give them the same opportunity. We talk about diversity, as you say, urban, rural is another element of that diversity, giving people who have less access more access, like, in the rural areas as well as the urban.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you all for this great conversation today. I think we covered a lot of topics, and it was, really informative and engaging, I think. So, thanks so much to all of you for taking time today to have conversations like this. Thank you so much to Courtney, Nathan, and Jamie, who was a frequent guest on the From the Edge podcast, for having this very full conversation with us today. It was one of my favorites. You can learn more about some of these organizations by checking out the links in our show notes. So thank you so much for tuning into the podcast today. If you know an entrepreneur or an entrepreneurial ecosystem builder who would benefit from hearing this conversation, we encourage you to please share this podcast with them so that they can learn from others in the Rochester community. All right, that is a wrap for us at the podcast today on this Summertime Rewind episode. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate you rating it and making sure that you are subscribed so that you never miss a story that we tell and so that others can find this podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next Wednesday.